So, I just recently played Crash Bandicoot 4, and at the beginning of the game, the first thing that comes up is the option to play in either modern mode or retro mode. And the only difference between these two modes is that in retro mode you have limited lives and game overs, and in modern mode you have unlimited lives. And also recently I played Sonic Origins, which had the option for either playing in anniversary mode or classic mode, which basically did the same thing. But something very interesting happened with Origins and its Anniversary and Classic mode, because the only way that you can play Sonic Origins in widescreen is to play in Anniversary mode. If you try to play in Classic mode, then you have to play the game in the original 4:3 aspect ratios that the old Sonic games had. And what I found to be particularly interesting, not surprising, but interesting, is that a lot of people were complaining that if they wanted to play the game with limited lives, they were forced to play it in 4:3, and a lot of people were asking for the ability to play with limited lives in widescreen. And I certainly agree with this sentiment just on principle, like, let players customize the game to be what they want. But at the same time, me personally, I don't really understand why anyone would want to play a game with limited lives. Something I've said multiple times on my channel is I just think that limited lives are stupid and they're bad. And I found it very interesting to see so many people asking for the ability to, what is in my opinion, just make the game worse. And I figured it would probably be a good idea to talk about limited lives and why I don't think they're good for games. This is obviously not a new topic at all in the world of video games. For years, people have been debating whether or not lives are outdated or whether or not they belong in games anymore and all that. And personally, I really don't like the idea of calling things in games dated, because nothing is really dated. Game design is just like an objective thing that exists. You can make any type of design in any type of game at any point, and it's equally valid. All that matters is whether or not the design is good. It's not that lives are outdated, it's that lives are bad. They've always been bad. They're bad now, and they were bad back then. But before I get into that, one thing I just want to get out of the way is that I am not a game designer, so, I'm not trying to say that my opinion is objectively correct or anything. I'm just someone that has a fascination with game design, and I've played a lot of games, and I think I've picked up a little bit of how game design kind of works, and so these are just kind of my thoughts coming from someone with a lot of experience playing games. So the first thing I want to talk about is lives in their implementation, and when and why they work in some designs for games. Because lives obviously originate from old school arcade games and such, and in that type of game design, I think that lives do make a degree of sense. Because one way to look at a game is a challenge. The game designers create this game and they are challenging you to complete it. Your objective in playing the game is to get to the end, is to beat the game. And so in that way, the entire game is one large challenge. However, typically, games don't function as one large challenge. They are broken into smaller challenges that are strung together, being things like levels. Each level has its own beginning and end, and you complete the level and then move on to the next one. This takes one large challenge and now splits it into many different challenges that you play through in sequential order. However, lives function to take these individual smaller challenges and string them together, connect them in a way where the game once again becomes one large challenge, because in most games your lives carry over from level to level as you play through the game. And so lives basically function as a resource. You have lives at the start of the game, and your objective is to complete the game, but you can only fail so many times during your playthrough, and if you fail too much, then you have essentially failed the entire challenge of completing the game, and so you have to start the challenge over. It's basically the exact same thing as dying and respawning at a checkpoint, but at a much larger scale. In this way, lives function as a resource, no different to like health or ammunition in a lot of games, where it's something that you have to use to get through the game, but you don't want to entirely run out of it or you'll be in trouble. So that design for lives, I think, works. However, lives start to have more problems once games start to implement the ability to play levels freely. I think this form of lives really only works when the game can only be played in one sequence, going from level to level. Something like the original Super Mario Bros. In that game, the moment you complete a level, you just are automatically sent to the next level, and you just have to continue. But then as we start to get to later games, they start letting the player play whatever levels they want as many times as they want throughout their playthrough. And this effectively just completely breaks the function of lives to make the game into one large challenge again, because now the earlier things you do as you play through a game will not necessarily have consequences in later parts of the game, because you can just return to levels and farm for lives as much as you want. If the idea of lives is supposed to be that if you die too much on this level, then you're not going to get very many attempts at the next level, and then you're going to game over and have to start over, then that completely goes out the window when the player has the opportunity to get as many lives as they choose. For example, let's say you're playing a game and you got 2 lives, you play through a level and you die on it 1 time. You then go on to the next level and you only have 1 life, which means that if you screw up, you're going to get a game over. Obviously, you don't want that, and so in order to avoid this, you have the option to just go back to, like, the first level in the game and play that over and over to get as many lives as you want. Now you can take on this next level with not just 1 life, but up to, like, 99 if you want. So now your mistakes no longer have consequences, which is what one of the purposes of lives was supposed to be. But also, this process of grinding for lives in and of itself, I would argue, is a flaw, because grinding for lives fucking sucks. It's just boring and repetitive as you just do the same thing over and over again. And you could argue that's supposed to function as a balancing system, like you can go back and farm for lives, but it's time-consuming and boring. But I don't really think that's good game design to have optimal options in a game be boring and unfun. The only thing that prevents a player from farming for lives is the fact that farming for lives sucks. Which all that really means is that you've implemented something in your game that sucks. Not to mention the fact that being able to grind up to 99 lives essentially makes having limited lives an irrelevant system. What is the point of having limited lives that are supposed to punish the player for dying too many times if they could just stock up on lives to the point where it's very unlikely they're gonna get a game over? And really, this problem can exist without even having to grind for lives, because a lot of games will give you so many lives for how easy the game is that you're really never going to run out of lives. I mean, fucking Banjo-Kazooie has limited lives. Has fucking anyone ever game overed when playing Banjo-Kazooie? I'm willing to bet that the vast majority of people who have played that game have not. So why are limited lives even in the game to begin with? Another problem that's been added to lives over time is the implementation of save systems. Now, save systems, I think, are actually fine with lives in the scenario where, when you reload your save, you are given the amount of lives you had when you activated the checkpoint if you are below the starting amount. However, not every game does that. Some games have it that when you get a game over, you'll go back to your save point, but you will have the starting amount of lives. The problem here is that it makes it so that dying at the beginning of a game or the beginning of a save point before you hit a checkpoint can be made irrelevant by exploiting the system. Because let's say you're playing a game that starts you off with 3 lives and you get to the first save point in the game. But in the process of getting to that save point, you ended up losing a life, so now you've only got 2 lives. Continuing on from here, you're going to be starting the next level with only 2 lives. Now, you can just continue on and make do with that, but the objectively correct thing to do here from a strategic perspective is to just kill yourself intentionally till you get a game over, and then continue from your save point, which will reset you back to 3 lives. Now this lets you start this new level with 3 lives instead of 2, so with this system, you benefit from killing yourself. At this point, you should just make it so that any time you start from a save point, you should just give the player the starting amount of lives if they're below that. Again, the only thing that prevents a player from doing this is the fact that it's time-consuming and annoying to do this every time you start a new level or whatever. And this actually isn't just a problem with lives. A lot of games have this kind of issue with power-ups as well. For example, in Crash Bandicoot, your masks carry over level to level. And so if you complete a level with no masks, then that means you're going into the next level without any extra hit points. But you can very easily just go back to an earlier, easier level and get 2 masks, and now you can start the level with extra hit points that you didn't technically earn. Once again, the only thing keeping you from doing this is the fact that it would be really tedious and annoying, which I think think the very existence of that option is a problem. And a game like Crash 4 realizes that's a problem because in this game, masks do not carry over level to level. You always start every level with no masks, so you can't abuse the system. When I see things like this in games that have limited lives, it almost makes me feel like the game designers had no idea what they were doing. Like, they didn't actually think about the ramifications of adding things like save points and the ability to replay levels into the live system. They just put a live system in the game because, I don't know, every game has a live system, so we're gonna put one in too. Like, these sorts of things are just so fundamentally flawed that I can't imagine any game designer intended for these kinds of things to be in the game, but they are. And while I did say that lives in their initial implementation I thought actually works, that doesn't mean I think that they're good. I still have problems with lives even in a more functioning system. For one thing, forcing players to replay stuff when they game over sucks. It's just not fun. There is a big difference between a player choosing to replay something in a game because they want to, and them being forced to because they got a game over. If a player is choosing to replay a game, they're obviously expecting to play stuff over again, and they're going into that knowing that's going to be the case. They're choosing that and accepting that fact. But when a player just wants to play a new part of the game and the game tells them, no, you're not allowed to play new parts anymore, you have to go back and do something you've already done, it's just like, what the fuck, why? This is just not fun. I've already done this. I want to do something new. Personally, my experience in playing games with limited live systems is that they just add boredom to the game because I end up having to do shit I've already done before that's not interesting anymore. Now, the idea here is supposed to be that you're playing the earlier part of the game in order to get more lives. The idea is that they want you to play better, to perform better, so you don't die as much and you collect more lives, so that way you will have more attempts on the difficult thing that killed you before. And while that can work and make replaying stuff less of a hassle because you're usually getting through it more quickly and easily than you did the first time, there are still issues here. Imagine you're playing a game, and as you go through it, you get a game over on the 4th level of a game, and now you have to restart and play the first 3 levels again in order to give yourself the best chances possible of completing the 4th level. You want to complete the first 3 levels as well as possible and get as many lives stockpiled up so that way you have lots of attempts. However, let's say that if you played absolutely perfectly and made no mistakes at all, the maximum number of lives you could get on the first 3 levels of the game is 10 lives. And you started the game with 3 lives, so now you're going into level 4 with 13 lives. But what if level 4 is just really hard and you're really struggling with it and you die 13 times on the level and now you game over again and now you have to start over again? At this point, you don't really have a way to improve at the first 3 levels. You've already completed them as well as the game will allow you to, and given yourself the best possible chance at completing level 4. So now, getting a game over and being forced to replay the first 3 levels is just wasting your time. You see how this issue keeps cropping up? This is one of the big issues with limited lives. They add a lot of things to games that really just serve to waste the player's time. Now, one of the biggest arguments that you hear in favor of limited lives in games is that they make games harder, and I do not agree with that at all. In fact, I in some ways feel the opposite of that. Because there are 2 main arguments that I hear in how lives are positive for games and how they make them more difficult in a good way. First of all, lives are an extremely valuable thing in a game, and they allow for games to have extra difficult optional challenges that the player can choose to risk going for that extra life, but they might end up dying in the process. Lives become a very good incentive for players to take on optional challenges that they might not otherwise choose to do. However, the flaw with this argument is that this is not a trait of lives. You can very easily achieve this exact same effect by just having a different collectible that does something else. Crash 4 has a very good example of this, where when you play in modern mode, all of the lives are replaced with golden Wumpa fruit that are worth 25 fruits. And you're going to have to get a good number of these things in order to get the gem for getting 80% of the Wumpa fruits on a level. So you still have plenty of incentive to go for these things, even without them being lives. There's plenty of other ways to do this kind of design. The same can also be said for collecting 100 of the game's base collectible, which usually rewards you with an extra life. You can just make it so that collecting whatever number of the base collectible gives you some kind of other reward. And here's another thing about these optional difficult challenges that you can go for lives, and this is to me one of the things about lives that actually doesn't make the game harder but kind of easier, is that lives only make the game more difficult for bad players. players, for good players, for high-level players, for experienced players, you can usually get through the game without having to worry about lives. You're probably not going to run out because you're good enough that you're just not going to die that much. And so all of these optional challenges to go for extra lives, you can just not do them, so the game ends up becoming easier. And just in general, the entire point of the lives ceases to exist once you get good enough at the game. At the start of the video, I was talking about Sonic Origins and people wanting lives back, and to me, I'm like, I can't even understand why, because if I play a classic Sonic game with lives, it doesn't even matter, because I will never game over in those games because I've played them so much. How can something make a game harder if it literally does not change the way that I have to play it? If something adds difficulty to a game that only affects low-skill players, then that means that it's not actually making the game more difficult. What it is doing is it's making the game more punishing. And this is the other thing I've heard from people in favor of games having limited lives, is that if you don't have lives, then there's no punishment for dying, there's no punishment for failing, you can just die as much as you want, and it doesn't even matter. And to me, this is so completely wrong as a way to think about games and a way to think about difficulty in games. Because dying in a game is not failing. Lives create this weird mentality in players that dying is something bad that you should not do as much as possible. And people say that because you have to start over again when you run out of lives, it means you have to play through the game better, and so it's forcing you to get better at the game. But I actually think that lives prevent players from getting better at the game because of what they end up doing to a player's mentality. Because with the threat of game overing, players really want to avoid dying as much as possible, which means players are less willing to try things that are difficult, to experiment, to try risky things that might not work, that might end up getting them killed. But the thing is, experimenting, trying things, dying and failing, that is how you get better at a game. And you can very easily see this effect when you watch players play games with limited lives. They will get very careful and very cautious around anything that starts to seem dangerous. What limited lives end up doing is they discourage players from trying to get better at the game, and instead relying on safe, easy tactics that they know will get them results. And this prevents players from trying to do more advanced things in the game, using more of their advanced moveset, trying to take shortcuts in order to complete levels faster, and just generally doing things that are kinda risky, but if you pull them off, it's really fun. One of the main principles of game design is risk versus reward, and generally taking bigger risks gets you bigger rewards. Doing things that are more difficult and more dangerous are usually the more fun and more effective things in games, but the fear of losing lives and game overing often prevents players from even attempting these kinds of things. And this all springs from this weird mentality that dying in games is something that should be looked at as bad. It's failing when it's really not. Dying in a game is just part of the process. It's part of the game. It's how you get better. And so the idea that if a player dies too many times, we're going to punish them for that is the most backwards thing in the world to me. We are going to punish players for not getting good at the game quickly enough. Like, what is the logic there? All you're doing is pushing away players who are trying to get better at the game. If you play a difficult game that has limited lives, then you better be a quick fucking learner or the game is going to tell you to go fuck yourself. And again, lives are not needed to achieve this kind of effect. There are other ways to encourage players to replay levels and try to do better on them. Ranking systems are one example that I think works pretty well. If you just grade the player's performance based on something like score or time, and then you give them rewards for getting good ranks, then that gives the player plenty of motivation to go back and try previous levels and do better on them. Crash 4 also has a good example where you get a gem for clearing a level with 3 deaths or less. These kinds of things achieve the same function of limited lives, forcing you to replay stuff and get better, without actually forcing that on the player, and so players will have a more positive attitude about this kind of thing because they are choosing to do it, rather than being bitter because they're being forced to. And by the way, one of the things that often happens when people criticize limited lives in games is they get slapped with the, oh, get good, the only reason you don't like lives is because you suck, blah blah blah, and all that crap. Well, in case anyone doesn't know, this is all coming from someone who is generally pretty good at games, and I am a very quick learner. I very rarely have these kinds of issues that I'm talking about when I play games with limited lives. And I'm someone that loves difficult games. I really enjoy when a game can offer me a real, genuine challenge. But lives do not offer genuine challenge, they just make the process of getting better at a game more tedious and take more time, which is what the real purpose of lives was initially. It was basically just to stretch out playtime because originally arcade games and early console games were very, very short. And as someone that does like really difficult games, pretty much all of my favorite hard games do not have limited lives, and I find them way more difficult than any game I've played that does have limited lives. Limited lives don't actually make games harder. Please stop trying to make that argument. They do not do that. They just make games more tedious, more annoying, and quite frankly, worse. In most of their implementations, I will say that there are ways to make limited lives work and be pretty good. For example, Streets of Rage 4 is a game that I think does lives very well. This game does not make all of the mistakes that other games do with their limited lives. First of all, you always start every level with 2 lives, no matter what. If you completed a level with 1 life or 60, doesn't matter, you're going on to the next level starting with just 2 lives. Or less if playing on higher difficulties. And also, Streets of Rage 4, like most beat-em-ups, when you die, you don't actually lose any progress. You don't go back to a checkpoint or anything, you just respawn right where you are and keep going. So in this way, lives in beat-em-ups don't really function like another attempt, they more act as multiple health bars. And so really, you have 3 health bars in order to complete this level with. And if you end up draining all 3 of your lives, then you have died. You have failed the challenge of completing this level, and so you have to start the challenge over from the beginning. This works well because there are no checkpoints. In games that have checkpoints, they are essentially doing the same thing that levels do with an entire game. They are taking one larger challenge and splitting it into 2 smaller challenges, where the game says that it is okay for you to complete half the level and then fail, because now you can start from the halfway point and complete the second half of the level. You do not have to do the entire level in one sequence without failing, and so it is now 2 separate challenges. This is why getting a game over in a game with checkpoints feels so bad, because it feels like you made progress by hitting that checkpoint, and then the game takes that progress away by making you start over. This is especially bad in games that make you start the entire game over if you run out of lives. But in a game like Streets of Rage 4 with no checkpoints, you haven't actually made any progress until you complete the level, and so you haven't actually lost anything when you really die by running out of lives, and so it doesn't feel discouraging like that. In a way, it kind of functions similarly to like the Estus Flash in Dark Souls. And thanks to this well thought out and good implementation, Streets of Rage 4 has my favorite use of limited lives in any game I've ever played. So that just goes to show that lives aren't inherently bad, it's just that they are oftentimes implemented in ways that just do not work well. In the case of most games, I think that they would be better not having limited lives if they're not actually going to implement them in a way that actually is good. Thank you for listening to my TED Talk on limited lives in video games. I hope you found this interesting and maybe learned something.